Okay, so here we are with Roger Castillo at Weekend Satsang, and I just want to say this has absolutely been great. We're in South Carolina on the beach, Isle of Palms, and we've had a great weekend so far, and I just want to thank you for everything and for your teaching and for coming to America, because that's a long flight from Australia.
Yeah, sure, it's fun. Come and visit friends, and then, we have chats like this that come out of a visit to friends. So, yeah, it's effortless.
Great, great. And effortless is a good word because, I've been around you and seen you this weekend, and this was my first time to see you in person. I'd watched a lot of videos before, and your teachings have been very helpful to me, have felt kind of like a final piece in the puzzle in many ways. And seeing you in person has actually reinforced the teachings, because I appreciate the fact that you're just kind of effortless and down to earth. You're not in some multicolored robe sitting on a throne or anything like that, So I appreciate your humanness.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me that you say you see this as a final piece of, or at least something that feels like quite progressed, given you mentioned a little bit about your journey up to this point in time. Because it can be that that's not appreciated, and in fact sometimes that's not the role of this teaching. It can serve to be an introduction to people, or it can be a refining of the more esoteric awakening type teachings. Not refining as, they dovetail in with each other. And because it talks about this from a practical daily living point of view, that's why it's not always appreciated as potentially being a final piece, because we can often get carried away with the notion that spirituality is sort of out of this world to some extent, and not about humanity, not about living daily life into human relationship. And that can happen because certain practices along the way are practices that take us out of daily living, but actually the integration or the full movement is a movement back into daily living, where we live as an ordinary human being. And so I just wouldn't feel comfortable being in a colored robe sitting on a throne.
Sure. Well, the reason I think that this teaching's been so valuable for me is that, I had an awakening experience that was very big when I was 21, 20 years ago now. And since then, it's been a challenge to basically kind of integrate the kind of consciousness and pure consciousness and all is consciousness with the body-mind, the spiritual and the psychological, physical, if you will, and the witness and the just, being in the body, being in the world. And what I appreciate about this teaching is it's just a very coherent framework, and especially because I had begun to actually be concerned that perhaps I had become too familiar with so many mystical teachings that it was all a little scrambled. And what I found here is kind of a conceptual framework that kind of everything in the framework points towards the same thing, and even energetically guides me there, just seeing it. And we were talking earlier that you feel that, as do I, that this comes very much out of the path of jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. And we do a lot of stuff in Christian mysticism, and that comes out of, I guess in that tradition it would be gnosis. Maybe not what the church meant by the historical controversy, but gnosis meaning the actual knowing or seeing into the misunderstanding. So yeah, it's really brilliant. Is there any possible way? What would you say if someone said, okay, 5 minutes or 10 minutes, what is the core of this teaching?
Right. So I'm not misguided by the fact that the actual process that people go through is varied and extensive usually. There's a lot of little insights that need to take place one after another, and you can't put the cart before the horse. And so I see this teaching as relying on the fact that someone has gone through a lot of other realizations, because the core framework doesn't necessarily go into the detail that our contemplation will go into. But it does give a framework which, in general terms, is quite extensive, and then means that all of our fine, detailed contemplation can be eventually, once we come out of the detail, we can see, oh, wow, that fits into this category in the framework. So I'll answer the question, what is the core of the teaching in that light? It gives it's a generalization. And so the core of the teaching is to firstly highlight what in practical terms this transformation is about. Because as I said, we can get lost along the way at different bus stops thinking that what's there at that bus stop is what it's all about. And frankly, the transformation needs to deliver something practical. Otherwise, what's the point? And what that is, the practical change is being able to remain in life, experiencing the flow of life, which is going to be pleasure sometimes and pain at others, from a place where we're at peace with whatever is happening. And peace is on the level of our attitude to the flow of life. And the peace is simply our true nature when the suffering, which is so common, that flares up when circumstance is out of line with our expectations. Suffering arises based on certain beliefs in the body-mind organism, and peace is what's there when that suffering no longer arises. So it's really a teaching that says there is happiness for the human being that's available in daily life, and that happiness looks like something very specific. It's not the happiness we think that we're after. It's not happiness through outcomes, but rather happiness in the form of peace of mind. And what is peace of mind? Peace of mind is simply the absence of suffering. What is suffering in practical terms? Suffering is guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And on what basis does that suffering arise? When we look at it, when we investigate for ourselves, we find that guilt, blame, and pride are all based on the foundation, the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership, meaning the interpretation that whatever happens through me, whatever happens through the other, is a result of me as a separate independent entity in control of everything I think, feel, and do. So that's the attitude of personal doership. And the other part of the attitude that creates suffering is the attitude, the belief that says my happiness is to be found in outcomes, my completeness is to be found in outcomes. And deep down, we really believe that my completeness is to be found in love. That's the attachment that's deepest ingrained. And when we look at the foundations of this suffering, we find that they're actually false assessments of who we are and false assessments of life. And so with a bit of pointing, with a bit of grace and destiny on our side, we can start to see these dynamics, and they can be seen to be false, and they can start to fall away. And so if the root or the foundation is an error or a mistake, a misinterpretation, then we can say that the suffering that arises from it is an error, a mistake, a misinterpretation, and that's great news, because it means it can come to an end. Which is why the happiness in the form of the absence of suffering, like the Buddha said, enlightenment is the end of suffering, that's why it's available.
Yeah, so it's good news. It sounds like it's a kind of negative approach where you're removing the suffering, but as you've mentioned before, you don't need to add anything. We have a kind of natural flow of life, kind of holding everything up already. We just need to remove what's in the way.
Yeah, and that's not at all how we've been sort of designed to see life, designed to see ourselves. We feel like something's missing, And because that feeling is there, which is not a feeling we create, it's a very standard sort of default program in the human being that something's missing, and so therefore this movement outward happens. And part of the realization along the way is to see that we're moving in the wrong direction. So this notion that we're not adding anything in, we're not here attaining or gaining anything, is a bit of a revelation. And frankly, if that bit doesn't fall into place, the pattern of that we're currently following is unlikely to stop.
Yeah, and what I appreciate so much, and I'm really glad you emphasized this, is the beliefs and the misunderstandings in place. While they can be intellectual, they're rooted in so deep. I mean, just kind of into the body, almost energetically. I mean, it's not like going to philosophy class and just kind of memorizing a certain thinker's thoughts and writing a paper about it. These are things that really, in my own experience, and like I think I'd mentioned in a satsang, go back to early childhood development, and you were saying, well, they're in so deep they even go back before that.
Yeah, you're spot on. This isn't just a script that is running consciously. This is part of our deeply ingrained development process. So because that's the case, there often isn't a perspective to it. There isn't the capacity to see it from a more objective position. We're lost in that identity that's formed. And so grace is a large part of this. So why did that belief get put in place, or how did it get put in place? It's not something that we did wrong. It's not something that we, of our own volition, put in place. It's actually part of the evolution process, part of the story of being human. And core to this teaching is saying that the changes that happen in the same way. They don't happen because you or I make them happen. It's a continuation of the process. So life put the error in place, life put the misunderstanding in place, and it's life that undoes the error. So often there's a form of our thinking that wants it to happen today, or and that in itself can be an obstacle to peace of mind, because it creates a resistance to what is. And what is the natural unfolding of life. So to the extent we can realize this, one, the guilt and shame can fall away, and we can allow then our imperfections to be there, even the imperfections. So when I say error that leads to suffering, it's not an error that shouldn't be there. It's there. It's part of the evolution of life. So it's part of the experience of life. So we can surrender to the fact this is how it is. And the magic happens in that. Not at all what the brain imagines. We think, well, if something's going to change for the better, we're going to have to make it happen. Whereas the irony is that if we start to see life as it is and relax, we start finding that what we're really looking for is delivered when we relax. That's paradoxical.
Sure, yeah, and what's interesting, you're talking about like we can't make it happen, I can't make it happen. There is really, no independent I. This idea that there is some independent doer separate goes to the core of everything. But what's interesting is some spiritual teachings will teach, so you turn the doer over, you turn self-will over to God's will. But I feel like this, in a sense, is taking it one step further, where you're basically saying, well, that independent self-will never really, was there, but the belief was there.
Sure, that's right. We believe that we were at some point in control. When we look at it, when we see the dynamic, is we were designed to function that way. So it was always God's will, even when the disconnection is happening, when the belief that I am the doer and I need this and that and the other, that movement is never the movement of a separate doer. So there never was the will of an individual being. There's always the unfolding of life according to life, or according to source, or according to God, whatever word you want to use. And so there's a beauty to see this, because we can't deny that there is the sense of free will, the feeling that in each moment I am speaking because I choose to speak, the feeling that I can move my hand to the right or to the left. So that feeling of free will is undeniable. If we come to see that all of this is part of my makeup that I wasn't in control of, and that therefore whatever I say is actually happening according to God's will, then fusion happens that can be quite magical. And that's the fusion whereby God's will and my will are now no longer seen as opposites, but seen to be two sides of the one coin. So I feel like I am living life on the one hand, and on the other hand, I know that I am being lived. And so God's will and my will essentially become the same thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And because, you know, you've also said that feeling of free will is a gift. Obviously, we don't want to feel like we're, you know, puppets on a string. And I mean, as far as I can tell, you know, you've mentioned one thing as far as biological evolution, you know, 1.5, 2 years old, a child maybe develops a sense of the feeling of free will. And obviously humans needed that to get to where we were today. I mean, I guess if we were, you know, trying to survive in the wild, I guess we'd need some sense of that. But I, you know, I also feel like we've taken it to such a big level because it's also in the larger culture so much. This, you know, we worship at the altar of personal responsibility here in America, man. You know, so it's kind of like, on the one hand, you know, there is no personal responsibility because there is no kind of independent person. And so actually thinking that you're responsible for your actions is only going to make you feel guilty, and other people are responsible for theirs will induce blame. But paradoxically, it feels as if the more you see that, it's almost like you become more responsible by default, or more empathetic and at ease and harmonious.
That's a great point. We tend to think that if I just surrender my will, then you know, how am I going to make things happen? How is life going to progress? So you talk about evolution historically needing certain attributes in order for progression to happen. And those attributes exist on the biological level. The body is prone to move towards pleasure and away from pain. So there's a biological intelligence that is at play. And each human being has a biological makeup and a biological intelligence. The belief in personal doership has layered itself on top of that biological intelligence and now becomes a sort of dual program running on top, which interprets everything as my doing and the other's doing, and that creates a psychological suffering. And because that's so ever-present, we sometimes assume that our actions and progress is happening because of this psychological level. But it's not. It's happening because of the biological intelligence. And so we can be really surprised in practice. The brain might hear these concepts and think, well, if the belief in personal doership falls away, this will be terrible for society. Everyone will act irresponsibly, and you know, life is bad enough as it is. There's cruel acts happening, people wanting more, and so the gap between the rich and the poor is getting bigger and bigger. And so if we drop the belief in personal doership, then things are going to get even worse. In fact, the very opposite in practice happens. As that belief in personal doership falls away, what essentially is falling away is the identity that feels like it needs more. And so greed and competition tend to fall away. We stop seeing the other as a competitor and a rival and an enemy, which is inevitable if we feel that our happiness is to be found in outcomes. We're bound to feel a sense of suspicion towards the other. So the falling away of this attitudinal belief in doership and attachment to outcomes in practice delivers something radically different to what we might think. And then we find ourselves functioning biologically with this biological intelligence that I spoke about earlier, able to function much more fully. And there's something in that nature of the human on a biological level that we could say is sort of altruistic, is that it's very happy to see other people happy. It doesn't take pleasure in seeing a big disparity between one person and the other. And so with the belief in personal doership, with this psychological filter through which we're so prone to see life, with that falling away, the human nature that pops out is surprising. Not at all what the thinking mind might have expected.
Right. So to shift gears just a little bit, not too much, but I'm curious about the Christian tradition, because in Contemplative Light we do a lot of work with the contemplative thread in Christianity, and I immediately saw it one place, and that was, rather than telling the story of life in evolutionary terms, to tell it in terms of Genesis. You could, tell me if this matches up or you'd put it differently, but I think of Adam and Eve eating the apple, and I think of the apple almost being the belief in personal doership. And, that creates the fall. They ate the apple. They passed on the belief in personal doership to everyone who came after. But it was an illusion, because actually God intended for them to eat the apple the whole time. They just think they did it.
That's right. And so I love that interpretation. If the story of Genesis and Adam and Eve is interpreted this way, as the unfolding of a story that had to unfold that way, they found themselves in a situation, and based on their makeup, or if we prefer, based on the script of the story. So there's two different ways. We can either see it as a creation or as a causal explanation. And so the notion that if God created man, then man is functioning as God created it. So how can man do anything other than God's will? So I like to see the fact that the eating of the apple was an inevitability. It was part of the story, and it was there in order for the fall from grace to happen. In order for life as we know it to happen, we could say that that's a forgetting of our true nature. The separation comes in. So interestingly, the apple is the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So that's where the duality comes in. The knowledge of good and evil, but not in a pragmatic sense of being able to discern the difference, but more in a attachment point of a way. Like, I need pleasure, and I am attacked by pain. So that's where the identity, the false identity, kicks in once that fruit is eaten. And if we look at it this way, then the notion of being punished by God can fall away, and we can start to love ourselves. So I would say that the continuation of the story is like the spiritual search. So Adam and Eve find themselves out of the Garden of Eden because they forget themselves. They find themselves in life that is suffering. And then I would say the process will carry on, where they start learning because it's part of the story. At some point they remember themselves. They recognize their essence, and then find themselves back in the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is not really a different place to life on Earth. It's just when a certain lens falls away. So I'm sure you're familiar. Once they ate from that fruit, they became self-conscious, and then they realized that they were naked. So it shows to me that it's about an attitude of how life is interpreted, rather than a shift from one place to another, but more an attitudinal veil that comes over us.
Yeah, in a sense, the shift kind of took place when they covered themselves, you know. Well, it's interesting because your own teacher, Ramesh Balsekar, I heard you say that this actually began almost as if a message from God put in a kind of Christian language, "Thy will be done."
Yeah, actually, I'd love to share the story, Ramesh's story.
That'd be great, yeah.
Yeah. So Ramesh, who's over here, was Indian, born into a Hindu family, a Brahmin Hindu family, which he was born into favorable circumstances, and so religion was very much part of the Brahmin Hindu lifestyle. And he had a guru, family guru, for most of his years as he was growing up, and he was a seeker. When he retired from the Bank of India as the managing director, and he said to himself, at age 60, I'm now going to focus my attention on seeking. I've been seeking my whole life, and so far I haven't found the answers I'm looking for. He said he's not even going to rely on teachers. He's had teachers for his whole life. So he said, I'm going to address this topic for myself, and I'm going to do it practically. And he'd make the point that he was a banker for his whole life, and that as a banker, you have to look at life practically. So he started to look at his life, and when he asked himself the question and kept it very practical, what am I really looking for? Why am I seeking? He said he came up with the answer that actually I'm just looking for happiness. Whatever I think I'm looking for it because I think it will make everything okay. So he said, let me boil it down to what I'm looking for is happiness. Then he said, well, I'm not exactly sure what this happiness is. I know that the happiness I've been looking for in the form of pleasure hasn't been delivered. I've received pleasure in my life, but it hasn't given me a sustainable happiness. So he sort of crossed off the idea that the happiness he was looking for was happiness through pleasure. But still, he said, if I'm really practical about this and drop all of my concepts and my beliefs, because maybe that's what's keeping me stuck, even the spiritual concepts and beliefs, I have to admit to myself, maybe I don't know for myself what happiness is, because if I did know, I wouldn't be seeking it. So he said, let me not draw any conclusions about what happiness is. Let me look at what I do know. And he said, look, there are many times during the day when I can put my hand on my heart and say I'm not happy. And so he worked from there. He said, when I can say I'm not happy, I'm going to see what is present. And he found that what was present was guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, the different forms of suffering. So from his own investigation, he was able to see that his unhappiness in life, which was something he could be very certain about, because he'd say, in this moment, I'm not happy. And each time he looked, it was one of these forms of suffering. And when he looked at the suffering, the guilt and the blame, for example, it seemed to make sense to him. He said, how can I expect for guilt and blame not to be here? If someone has done something that's hurt me or hurt someone I love, I have to blame them. And if I've done something that on reflection seems stupid and has delivered a negative outcome, then I have to feel guilty or shame. So having gone through this process and seen that his unhappiness was guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, knowing that he's looking for happiness, he's then said, well, it's unrealistic to expect this unhappiness not to be there. And so if it's unrealistic for this unhappiness to not be there, then I can conclude that happiness isn't available for the human being. And being a pragmatic person and having addressed it pragmatically, he said, in this case, I'm now content to stop seeking, having come to the conclusion for myself that happiness for the human being is not available. So that was the end of his seeking career for a while. He said it wasn't long before he got a message that came to him from outside, with the words he used, a message from God, if you like. And the message said, Ramesh, you are wrong. Happiness for the human being on a continuous and unbroken basis is your birthright. And the basis on which this happiness is available is the very basis of all religions. A basis that has been forgotten for thousands of years, which is why there have been religious wars for that long. End of message. So, with this new information, having analyzed it a little bit, Ramesh had to resume his search. Because firstly it said, Ramesh, you are wrong. Happiness for the human being is your birthright. And the basis on which this happiness is available is the basis of all religions, a basis that has been forgotten, which is why religious wars have been happening. So he needed to find out what the basis of all religions was. And he was very familiar with Hinduism. He liked and was somewhat familiar with Christianity, and so he opened the Bible and was flicking through, and at some point he said he came across these 4 words. And when he read them, he was struck by the 4 words, and it dawned on him, this is the basis of all religions. And the words were, thy will be done. And as he thought about this more, he knew that in Islam there is a well-known reference to inshallah, God willing. He knew Hinduism and made reference to the fact that Hinduism says that everything is God's will in a very profound way. Thou art the speaker and thou art the listener. So whatever is happening is not you and the other, but just the one source. Everything is happening according to God's will. And so with this in the mix, he reassessed his earlier conclusion and saw that guilt, blame, and pride make sense when there is a sense of me as the doer. Me as some entity that is separate and insulated from life and autonomous and in control. And then when we see the other in the same way, there is the other as the doer. Now, this is saying that life is not like that. The revelation he's received is the core of all religions, is life is a happening according to God's will. So looking at the hatred towards the other, in this light, we now see that, oh, my attitude towards the other, which was to hate the other for what they did, is not an attitude that would be sustained if we saw that what the other is doing is part of destiny, part of life unfolding according to God's will. That what happens to me when I receive the pain, that's my destiny unfolding, part of a happening. It's all a happening according to God's will. And so from this perspective, we still have to endure the pain of the situation, but we now see the other as a universal brother or sister, doing exactly what they're destined to do as part of their role in this story of life. And now the attitude of hatred, the attitude of shame can fall away. It no longer makes sense. So I'm always functioning according to my destiny. I'm always doing exactly what I'm meant to be doing. And the other forms of suffering, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome, no longer make sense, because if life is going to unfold one way according to God's will, then what's the point of me worrying about how it unfolds? My worry is not going to change what unfolds. My expectation of how it should unfold is just going to be an extra layer of an extra expectation that we're bound to feel disappointed about
Sure, sure. And for most of us at the satsang as well, another thing that we're not in charge of or in control of unfolding is our own enlightenment, our own ending of suffering. We're not in charge of our own process, and I think that ends up becoming a potential block. I know it has with me some in this teaching. It's like I want to see the teaching. I want to keep seeing the teaching, but part of the teaching is that it's going to unfold according to destiny.
Exactly. Even our attitude, which is still a function of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, or part of the story of life unfolding, is not in our control. So how does life bring about change? Well, life brings about change by, in each moment, presenting new conditioning to us in the form of the circumstance we're in, and in the form of the feedback we get as a result of a circumstance and our contemplation. All of that is delivering new conditioning. It's a feedback loop that changes our up-to-date conditioning. And so at a certain point in time, we could exclaim, my attitude has changed. But hopefully with the understanding that my attitude has changed because life brought about the change. So if we look at Ramesh's story I just narrated, at some point, according to his makeup and what had come before, including his investigation of his own, came to the conclusion, that's it, no need to seek for happiness, it's not available for the human being. And then, out of the blue, a new input came in. Now, he wasn't in control of when and how that input came in or what it contained. And so we can look at that as grace, but not only the input that came from outside, but everything, all of the circumstance that unfolds moment after moment is not in our control. So it's those inputs that we're not in control of that trigger the evolving change. So it's just good luck in a sense, but probably more than just luck, part of the story, the amazing creation of life, that we change in such a way that this suffering can come to an end.
Sure, and I also appreciate the way you talk about how the process can unfold differently for everyone. In a sense, there can be dramatic, energetic shifts as the misunderstanding gets uprooted, or it could just be a slow kind of wearing down of the misunderstanding. You could have big oneness experiences, or it could be a series of small oneness experiences. Could you talk about that a little bit, how the process unfolds for different people?
Yes, I guess what we're most familiar with is the way the process is unfolding for us, and especially if the process is unfolding for us and it's delivering positive change, then we can sometimes become a little bit narrow-minded and think this is the only way. And if we're fortunate enough and we start to get evidence, if we're listening to other people, seeing other people's process, we start to get evidence that, well, actually this person has ended up in more or less the same place, and yet when they narrate their story, when they narrate their path, it's very different to what I experienced. So we can, once again, through life, delivering certain new inputs, we can start to appreciate that it's not necessarily one size fits all. And that can also be seen once we start to appreciate that there are very many different paths, teaching paths, and even within one path there are many teachings that dovetail in with each other, and each teaching addresses a certain set of problems, and therefore we can see that maybe different teachings take over at different phases in the process, and the process is unique in a sense to each individual. So I guess I came through a non-dual esoteric set of teachings that were talking about oneness and the falling away of separation, and weren't necessarily focused so much on the practical aspect of daily living. And as a result of that conditioning, at some point there was a very impressive oneness experience where life presented itself in a way that it has never presented itself like prior to that point. And so many of the pointers that were presented in the oneness teachings were revealed in a way that was so profound, not at all a revelation through the intellect, but just through the way the moment presented. And in that moment, there was a clear realization that what I am is not the body. What I am is awareness in which the whole experience arises. Now, looking back on that, I'm not sure that that realization was as absolute as it presented at the time. Not necessarily as absolute as I interpreted. It was an experience that happened. And it maybe didn't prove what I thought it proved at the time that it happened. But nonetheless, it was a result of things shifting. It was also laying foundations on which certain contemplation would happen after that. And so it was very significant in my process. But I now look at it as being just what was needed for Roger. I don't relate to it the way I related to it at the time, or maybe even years after it. And so there's a lot of people who are exposed to non-dual teachings that are waiting for this big, profound shift to happen, almost expecting it to happen and for it to be a radical change that happens overnight. That tends to happen because we talk about these experiences, and when we talk about the experiences and put the experience into words, it sounds, wow, I'd like one of those. And we can lose track of what it is we're really looking for. We're not looking for oneness. We're not looking for a oneness experience. I am very clear, based on my own experience, that what I was always looking for, whether I realized it or not, was the very simple capacity to live as Roger, doing whatever Roger's circumstance dictates in life, so living as a human being, and finding myself able to live as a human being free of suffering, in peace. And that's my experience, but it's not an experience that's accompanied by a oneness experience. And so if someone said, well, let me give you something, I'll give you a oneness experience so you can live in that state that you had when the oneness experience happened. And there could be a side effect. You might lose something of your current experience. I'd say, no, thank you. That's fine. You keep your oneness experience. I have absolutely no interest in it. Like, I mean it from the bottom of my heart. That someone could offer me $5 billion just to change it from spiritual materialism of being attached to a oneness experience to $5 billion. I say, no, thank you. I'm not at all interested in it. What is important for me is the state that I find myself in through grace, which is where suffering, guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation no longer arise. And in order for that state to settle in, somewhere along the line, wasn't too much long after that oneness experience, there needs to be a deep realization that, oh, I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for peace of mind and daily living. And unless that is registered deeply, then the likelihood is we will keep looking for life to be lived in a more, in a way that delivers some sort of pleasure, some sort of state change. Whereas I would like to repeat again that according to this teaching framework based on my own experience and one that was supported by Ramesh's experience, in practical terms, the only thing that really satisfies on an ongoing basis is to find ourselves living as a human being, which is what we're destined to live as in this life, but free of suffering.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I almost feel like sometimes the spiritual marketplace, if you will, almost kind of sets it up as if we're supposed to have this dramatic experience, and then maybe we do have that experience, but then we wake up the next day and we have to deal with, all the same worries and concerns, and you're kind of like, what's the point? Or you don't have that experience and you think something's wrong, but it's interesting because a lot of people are very, seem attached to telling a grand story. And what I found, and you've echoed this, is telling a grand story of expectations of how it's supposed to be eventually becomes almost a pressure you're putting on yourself and becomes a block.
Sure, yeah. And having said that, I can re-listen to what I've just said, and I'd like to point out that if we turn the end of suffering into the new expectation that becomes the only validity that life looks like for us. So if we hear about the potentiality to live life without suffering, that's great information to have, as long as we can hold it in a way that doesn't then turn that into an expectation, which then will inevitably make us resist suffering when it arises. So if we really come to see what the end of suffering is, it's the end of resisting what is. And so part of the understanding is to recognize that from time to time, until the deeply ingrained beliefs are uprooted by life, suffering is still going to arise. If we have an expectation that life should be free of suffering, then we're going to resist our experience of life that contains suffering. If we're really clear on the different forms of suffering and a deep understanding starts to kick in, then the movement to resist the suffering that is arising doesn't happen, and then we find that there is a witnessing of the suffering, which means peace with the lack of peace. And in time, that understanding, which is now not resisting our own suffering, that understanding will permeate deeper and deeper into the system, such that even the suffering that we're now witnessing no longer arises.
Well, thank you for everything you've done, and thank you for this teaching, and thank you for carrying on the work of Ramesh. As I was telling you during lunch break, I discovered you originally through Leonard Cohen, and I had noticed that Leonard Cohen got a lot less depressed towards the end of his life, and he credited Ramesh, and I looked into Ramesh and discovered and wondered, does he have any students carrying on the teaching? And that's how I've come to you. And when I saw you were going to be in South Carolina, I was like, wow, of all places, Isle of Palms. I was at a college buddy's beach house there like 20 years ago. That's where Roger Castillo is coming. That's crazy, So I drove up here, and it's been an honor. And thanks for doing the interview.
My pleasure. Thanks for showing an interest.
All right.